The moment Nolan Frey read the address from his sealed letter, calmly, without looking up, the way a man reads something he has already memorized. Victoria Haines felt her hand close around the envelope in her own lap and go completely still. She had been certain, until that exact moment, that the man sitting beside her in the airport shuttle was simply a technician who had booked the wrong vehicle. She had been composing a polite but firm explanation for why he would need to find other transportation. Now she made herself breathe once, slowly, and asked him to read it again. He did. It matched hers word for word. The same private road, the same iron gate in the Connecticut hills, the same name embossed at the top of both letters, Ash. And the same hour, 7 o'clock that evening, a deadline that left them exactly 43 minutes, depending on the storm. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch after that. The countryside moved past the rain-streaked windows in smears of charcoal and dark pine, and Victoria Haines, who had not been caught genuinely off guard in 2 decades of running one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the Northeast, sat very still in the back of a rattling airport shuttle and tried to understand what she was holding in her hands. It had started 4 hours earlier at Whitmore Regional Airport, when a storm system rolling in from the Atlantic made clear it had no intention of cooperating with anyone's schedule. Victoria had been on the phone with her chief financial officer, Preston Wolfe, standing at the gate window and watching the departure board flip her flight to Conneaut when the automated text arrived from her assistant. All ground transport in the region had been suspended until further notice. Preston, who was already at the estate and growing impatient through the phone screen, had urged her, in the clipped tone he reserved for situations he considered avoidable, to find any way to reach Hartfield Road before Harrison Locke used her absence to move things in his own direction. Victoria had ended the call and gone to the transportation desk, where the only available vehicle, a hired airport shuttle operated by a local family company, the kind of van that smelled faintly of pine air freshener, and carried a crocheted mat on the dashboard, had already been booked online by someone with faster internet than her assistant. The booking name read N. Frey. She had found him near the baggage carousel, a tall, lean man in his late 40s wearing a canvas work jacket with a company logo she didn't immediately recognize, carrying a standard duffel and a small backpack that seemed to belong to a child rather than a grown man. It was lavender, printed with cartoon planets. He was not on a phone call. He was standing still, reading something on a folded piece of paper, and the particular quietness of him, the complete absence of the anxious kinetic energy filling the rest of the terminal, was the first thing she registered. She explained her situation without editorializing. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not what she expected. Then he said the shuttle was already paid for and he was on a deadline himself, and he offered her the seat beside him instead of the alternatives. A rental with a 3-hour wait, a cab that would take 90 minutes just to arrive. She accepted because she had no better option. She spent the first 20 minutes of the drive responding to board messages, barely registering the man beside her beyond a general impression of stillness. It was the lavender backpack on the seat between them that eventually pulled her attention. She noticed the small stuffed rabbit, buckled carefully into the front pocket, its ears pressed flat against the zipper, packed with the obvious deliberateness of something that would be expected on the other end. "Your daughter?" she asked, more to fill the silence than from genuine curiosity. "Abby," he said. "She's 9. Staying with her grandmother tonight." He paused a beat. "She didn't want to lend me the rabbit, but I told her I might need it for good luck." Victoria returned to her phone. It was only when he mentioned, completely without performance, that the road they were on had been repaved incorrectly at the last maintenance cycle. Something about drainage angles that caused ice to form in a particular pattern in winter, that she looked up and asked how he would know that. He told her he had spent 7 years doing field calibration for laboratory equipment. Before that, he had worked in biomedical research. He offered nothing more. She filed it in the part of her mind that cataloged things worth examining later and let the conversation drop. They rode through 20 more miles of rain before he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, produced a sealed envelope with an unusual embossed seal at its center, and rested it on his knee. She recognized that seal immediately. And then he read the address, and everything she had assumed about the next several hours ceased to be accurate. The Ash estate appeared through the rain as a low stone wall running along a private road that no mapping application acknowledged. Beyond the iron gate, the driveway curved through old-growth trees toward a house that was large without being ostentatious. The kind of house that had always held books and instruments rather than furniture selected for impression. A row of vehicles was already parked along the gravel sweep in front, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows, and a silver sedan Victoria recognized as belonging to Preston Wolfe. The airport shuttle sat among them exactly as out of place as it was. A man she didn't recognize, one of Harrison Locke's security staff, she assumed from the posture, crossed the gravel toward the van the moment it stopped, looked at the vehicle, looked at Nolan Frey climbing out of the passenger door, and drew a conclusion that was written plainly on his face before he reached them. He asked if they were delivering something from the airport. Victoria stepped out on the other side and identified herself in the flat, deliberate tone she used, when she did not intend to explain herself twice. The man straightened and redirected his attention at once, offering to carry her bag, asking whether she would like to step inside out of the rain. Harrison Locke emerged from beneath the portico a moment later. He was 61 years old, and had the kind of wealth that had long since stopped requiring him to perform courtesy for anyone he didn't need something from, though he could produce it efficiently when he judged it useful. He produced it for Victoria now, and then turned to look at Nolan Frey with the brief, assessing glance of a man who had already decided the answer before asking the question. He reached into his overcoat and withdrew a folded bill, extending it toward Nolan without fully redirecting his attention, suggesting the shuttle could pull around to the service entrance on the east side of the property. Nolan did not take the money. He said quietly and without any particular heat that he had been invited. Locke's expression shifted into something that resembled patience but was not. He said that seemed unlikely, and that if someone had given him incorrect information, he was sorry for the inconvenience. Nolan produced his sealed envelope. Locke glanced at it the way a man glances at a claim he intends to dispute, and said that documents could be obtained by anyone willing to put in the effort, and that the meeting inside was of a deeply private nature. Victoria watched the exchange and said nothing. She was still holding her own envelope and still turning over the implications of 2 identical letters, 2 identical seals, and 1 impossible address that had brought a pharmaceutical CEO and a field technician to the same iron gate in a Connecticut rainstorm. She was still working through it when the front door of the house opened behind Locke, and a woman in her 60s stepped onto the portico in a charcoal blazer, carrying the particular expression of someone who has prepared for exactly this kind of delay and has decided in advance not to find it interesting. She crossed the gravel directly to where Nolan stood and extended her hand. She introduced herself as Charlotte Vane, attorney for the estate of Dr. Bernard Ashe. She announced, at a volume that carried clearly across the wet gravel, that the proceedings could not lawfully begin without the presence of both designated heirs, and that the individual standing before her was, in fact, the primary scientific heir named in Dr. Ashe's final will and testament. She then turned to Harrison Locke and informed him, with a politeness entirely devoid of warmth, that the arrangements for this evening had been made by a man who had spent 50 years in science and very little of that time accommodating other people's impatience. Locke did not respond. Victoria watched his jaw tighten and smooth again in the span of a single breath, and she recognized the particular effort that restraint required from a man who was not accustomed to needing it. Nolan Frey waited with the same quietness he had carried since the airport terminal. And for the first time since she had found him standing at the baggage carousel, with a child's backpack over one shoulder, Victoria Haines looked at him and understood that she had been reading the situation entirely wrong. Inside the house, the library had been arranged for the reading of a final message. A projector stood at one end of the long table. Sealed folders sat at each place. Charlotte Vane opened her folio and explained that Dr. Ashe had recorded a statement in the weeks before his death, to be played only when both heirs were present together in the same room. The lights dimmed. Bernard Ashe's face appeared on the wall. Older than Victoria, remembered from company visits years ago, his voice carrying the measured effort of a man who had made peace with his illness, but not with a decision he had deferred too long. He spoke without preamble. He said that the compound known internally as Helix 7 had been developed almost entirely through the research of a scientist named Nolan Frey. Beginning in the winter that Frey's wife, Rachel, was first diagnosed with Vellum syndrome, a progressive autoimmune disorder, with at that time no approved treatment. He said that Frey had continued the work after Rachel's death, not for recognition and not for financial return, but because he believed the compound could help children who were developing the same early markers his daughter Abby was beginning to show. He said that the clinical trial had been deliberately destroyed. The silence in the room was total. Victoria sat very still and let the words arrange themselves into a shape she did not want to examine too directly. Ashe continued. He said that 7 years ago he had remained silent when the trial's failure was formally attributed to problems in Nolan Frey's research methodology. He had been afraid that speaking the truth would cost him his relationship with Haines Bioworks, whose investment capital was the only thing sustaining 3 other research programs he could not afford to lose. He called this the worst decision of his professional life and said he was sorry. And the sorrow in his voice had the quality of something rehearsed and still unresolved. The terms of the will were precise. Nolan Frey would hold sole scientific authority over Helix 7, its development pathway, its safety standards, its research integrity. Victoria Haines would hold commercial guardianship, responsible for bringing the compound to market, given Haines Bioworks' production infrastructure. Neither guardian could act without the written consent of the other. If they failed to reach an agreement by 9 o'clock the following morning, the compound and all associated intellectual property would transfer into a nonprofit medical trust and be unavailable for commercial licensing for the next 10 years. Harrison Locke offered to purchase Nolan's guardianship rights before the recording had finished playing. He named a figure designed to function like gravity. Nolan said no. He said it the same way he had read the address from his letter, without inflection, without hesitation. The absence of negotiation seemed to unsettle Locke in a way the number apparently had not been designed to account for. A brass key sat at the center of the table when the lights came up. Charlotte Vane explained that Dr. Ashe had maintained a working laboratory in the basement, sealed and independent from any external network, accessible only to both heirs together. Whatever waited inside, she said, would clarify details the recording alone could not provide. Preston Wolfe was left in the library under Charlotte Vane's supervision along with Harrison Locke, an arrangement that satisfied neither man and therefore suited Victoria entirely. The laboratory was reached by a narrow staircase behind a section of built-in shelving. Its air was cool and faintly metallic, and the equipment along the walls was older than anything Victoria's facilities used but clearly maintained with precision. At the center of the room sat a rack of offline servers, connected to a terminal that appeared not to have been touched, since Nolan's research was still active. He typed the startup sequence from memory. His hands moved at the keyboard with the fluency of someone recalling a language their body has not forgotten. The screens came to life around them one at a time. She watched him work and felt the particular discomfort of beginning to understand something she had been successfully not understanding for 7 years. He navigated through the archived files without speaking. Then he stopped. Buried within a folder of trial documentation sat 2 versions of the same safety report. The official version, the one that had been used to terminate the Helix 7 trial, attributing its failure to inconsistent methodology registered under Nolan Frey's laboratory credentials. Beside it, in a separate archived file that Bernard Ashe had clearly preserved without ever disclosing, was the original version of that same report. The 2 documents differed in precisely 5 data points. 5 data points that, in the original, showed the compound clearing every safety threshold it had been given. In the official version, those same 5 figures had been altered, not dramatically, not in any way that would attract attention during a routine review, but enough. Enough to fail the trial. Enough to give the board a documented reason to withdraw funding and close the program permanently. The digital signature attached to the alteration belonged to Preston Wolfe. Victoria leaned closer to the screen and read it twice. The timestamp showed the modification had been made 18 hours before the trial's official review meeting. The authorization signature at the bottom of the altered file was Wolfe's, not routed, not proxied, his. Nolan said nothing. He turned the screen slightly so she could read it without strain, and he waited. She tried to reach Wolfe on her phone. No answer. She tried twice more. When she looked up, Nolan was watching her with an expression that was not unkind, but offered nothing in the way of reassurance. He asked how long Wolfe had been with the company. She said 11 years. He nodded once. They backed up the relevant files to a portable drive and returned upstairs. Preston Wolfe denied everything with the practiced steadiness of a man who had prepared his denial well in advance of the question. He called the archived file a fabrication, positioned the entire discovery as the foreseeable behavior of someone with a documented grievance and a clear motive for revenge, and suggested, carefully, in the language of corporate risk management, that giving any credibility to the accusation would expose Victoria personally to significant liability. Harrison Locke moved in alongside, offering a private arrangement. The drive would be surrendered. Wolfe would retire with a transition package, and Nolan Frey would receive a sum that Locke named with the confidence of someone accustomed to numbers, being the final word in any conversation, in exchange for a formal withdrawal from the guardianship and a signed non-disclosure agreement. Victoria was quiet for long enough that the room began to assume she was considering it. She was thinking about Abby Frey, 9 years old, staying with her grandmother tonight. Her immune system already showing the early markers of the same disease that had killed her mother. Markers that Helix 7 had been designed 7 years ago to interrupt before they progressed. She was thinking about what it meant that this compound could have existed in the world for the past 7 years already. What it meant that it did not. She set her phone on the table and told Wolfe she would not be signing anything tonight. The temperature in the room changed. Locke warned her with the measured calm of someone describing an outcome rather than issuing a threat that his firm would withdraw every line of credit extended to Haines Bioworks before the week was out. The implication was plain. The company would not survive that withdrawal. Not in its current condition, not without a restructuring that would take the better part of 2 years and cost more jobs than she had personally authorized in her entire tenure. Victoria said that a company held together by buried evidence was not a company she was willing to preserve in its present form, and that she had spent too long building it to let it become something she could not look at directly. Nolan told her quietly that she was free to take the easier path, that he would carry no resentment toward her if she did. She could hear that he meant it. She said she knew, and she stayed where she was. The drive disappeared from the laboratory an hour later. The isolated power circuit serving that section of the basement went dark for exactly 9 minutes. Long enough for someone who knew the building to pull the drive from the server rack and return upstairs before the lights came back on. The hallway cameras covering the laboratory entrance recorded nothing for those 9 minutes. Nolan found the drive the following morning in the storage compartment of Harrison Locke's SUV, located by the backup transmitter he had embedded in the drive casing. A habit developed during the years, when he had learned not to rely on the permanence of evidence that other people had access to. Locke claimed immediately that the drive had been planted to frame him. It was, Victoria observed, the first thing he had said all evening that sounded unrehearsed. Charlotte Vane ordered the estate gates sealed and invoked a legal preservation clause from Bernard Ashe's will requiring all parties to remain on the property until the circumstances surrounding the missing drive could be properly documented. While the drive's contents were being restored and verified, a secondary audio file surfaced inside a compressed archive that neither Victoria nor Nolan had opened during the night. It was dated 7 years ago. It was a recording of a private conversation between Bernard Ashe, Harrison Locke, Preston Wolfe, and a fourth man whose voice Victoria recognized before her mind had caught up to what she was hearing. Her father. He had been the one to approve the final decision, not because he believed the trial had failed on its merits. The recording made clear that he did not, but because Locke's investment had represented the only viable path to the company's survival at a moment when Haines Bioworks was carrying a debt load that could have ended everything her father had spent 30 years building. He had known the trial's termination was engineered. He had signed the internal memo that closed it permanently, and he had asked, in the same measured voice Victoria had grown up hearing across a dinner table, that the matter be handled quietly and not revisited. Victoria listened to the recording through to its end without speaking. Nolan sat across the table from her, his hands folded, and looked at the table rather than at her, giving her the privacy of not being watched, while something inside her came apart and tried to reassemble itself into a shape that could still function. She had built 12 years of her leadership on a version of the company's history that did not include this conversation. She had defended decisions, hired people, set direction, and asked her employees to trust the organization, whose moral foundation, she now understood, had been quietly hollowed out in a conference room 7 years before she was ever promoted to lead it. She apologized. The words came out imprecise, the way genuine apology sometimes does when it arrives before the speaker has fully composed it. Nolan told her that he did not need an apology from someone who had not been in the room when the decision was made. She said that was generous of him. He said it was not generosity. He said it was simply accurate. She convened an emergency board meeting at 8:15 in the morning, patching every director through a secure video connection from Charlotte Vane's office. Wolfe submitted a preemptive motion to place Victoria on administrative leave pending a review of her judgment. A motion Harrison Locke had clearly helped draft overnight, given its timing and its language. Victoria addressed it by presenting the forensic comparison of the 2 safety reports before any director had spoken. She walked the board through the altered data points with the precision of someone who had spent the night verifying every figure. She did not editorialize. She let the timestamps and the signatures do the speaking. Nolan presented the scientific record, what Helix 7 had demonstrated in the original trial data, what its development pathway looked like against current research standards, what the compound's safety profile actually showed when read against the unaltered evidence. 2 board members asked him to slow down and repeat sections. He did, without impatience. A director who had been with the company since its second year of operation asked Nolan directly, with genuine rather than rhetorical skepticism, what made him confident enough in the compound's safety to bring it back through regulatory review now, after everything that had happened. Nolan said he would not bring it through if he were not confident. He said his daughter's name once, briefly, and did not use it as a rhetorical device. Only mentioned that he had a personal reason to be certain he was right about this, and then returned to the data. Locke's motion to remove Victoria failed by a margin that surprised even her. Wolf was suspended pending a formal investigation, which 2 board members confirmed they had already separately requested from outside auditors, based on irregularities they had identified months earlier and not yet fully understood. Harrison Locke withdrew from the estate before noon and left in one of the black SUVs without looking at anyone. His departure was followed, over the subsequent weeks, by shareholder complaints and a formal inquiry into the company's treatment pipeline disclosure practices over the prior decade. Victoria held a press conference 2 weeks later. She acknowledged the company's role in the suppression of the Helix 7 trial. She named the compound by its correct attribution, Frey-Ashi compound, as Bernard Ashe had listed it in his original documentation, and announced the restructuring of Haines Bioworks research governance around an independent scientific oversight council. The admission cost the company a quarter of its stock value in the 2 days following. Within 6 weeks it had recovered, driven by 3 new research partnerships and a licensing agreement that Charlotte Vane had been quietly arranging through Ashe's professional network for months before his death. Nolan declined the executive title Victoria offered him in the restructured organization. He accepted the chairmanship of the Oversight Council, which gave him genuine authority over the scientific integrity of every compound in the company's pipeline, without requiring him to relocate or change the texture of his daily life. He kept his field technician schedule on a reduced basis, unwilling to walk away from the livelihood he had rebuilt carefully during the years, when he had nothing else to rely on. The regulatory pathway for Helix 7 moved faster than anyone had projected, supported by the original trial data that Bernard Ashe had preserved, and by 7 years of independent research that Nolan had continued, quietly, on his own time, and with equipment he had repaired himself because he could not afford to purchase it. In the spring of the following year, Abby Frey was enrolled in the first compassionate use protocol. The specialist who supervised her told Nolan that the compound's early results were, in her careful medical language, encouraging. He drove home from that appointment alone and sat in his car in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. The lavender backpack was in the passenger seat. Abby had stopped asking him to take it for good luck a few months earlier, because she had decided, with the authority of a 9-year-old who considers a matter settled, that it had done its job and she wanted it back. He brought it inside anyway. Victoria drove to his house on a Saturday in late October, arriving without her assistant and without a scheduled agenda. He was in the driveway doing something to a neighbor's car, working with the focused quiet she had come to recognize as the default state of a man who had learned to find meaning in whatever was directly in front of him. She had brought the finalized research foundation documents for his signature and had made a specific detour for the coffee, because she had learned during the months of working together that it required one. He signed where indicated and read what he was signing first, which she had come to expect from him. Then he looked at the foundation's name on the masthead, the Frey-Ashi Research Foundation, and was quiet for a moment. She asked if the name was right. He said it was more than right. They stood at the edge of the driveway while the coffee cooled and the neighbor's car sat open on the jack stands. And Victoria found herself thinking about the shuttle driver who had looked at the booking confirmation that rainy afternoon at Whitmore Regional, and offered the seat beside him to a woman who had given him no particular reason to be generous. She had offered almost nothing in return. She had barely looked at him. She said she had meant to ask him something for a while. She asked why he had agreed to share the vehicle that day, given that she had done very little to earn the consideration. He said he had a sick daughter at home, a deadline, and no time to argue about booking confirmations in a rainstorm. She said that wasn't the whole answer. He thought about it for a moment. He said that in his experience, the people who are least worth helping are sometimes the ones who most need it, and he had learned a long time ago not to use first impressions as a reason to withhold something he could give without cost. She thought about that for longer than the drive home. 3 months later, she called him on a Tuesday afternoon with no particular agenda, only to ask whether he and Abby would want to come to the Foundation's opening ceremony the following weekend. She mentioned that a section of the new research wing was being named for Bernard Ashe, and that it seemed like something worth being present for. Nolan said he thought so too. He said Abby had recently decided she wanted to be a scientist. She had announced it with the certainty of someone who had not yet learned to qualify her ambitions, and he had told her that seemed like a very good idea. Victoria said she agreed. The ceremony was on a clear November morning. Nolan arrived with Abby in the passenger seat, and she spent the first several minutes of the event examining every piece of equipment in the lobby display, with the methodical attention of a person who intends to understand things, not simply observe them. Victoria watched from across the room and thought, not for the first time, that the most important moments almost never arrive in the shape you expect them to. They come in rattling airport shuttles during rainstorms. They sit quietly in the seat beside you and ask for nothing. They read an address from a sealed letter in an unhurried voice, and the whole direction of things shifts. And you understand, too late, and then just in time, that the person you nearly dismissed without a second glance was the one who changed everything worth keeping.